Hey, it's Executive Editor Stephen Lacey. If you're hearing this on the Carbon Copy, you know me as the host. If you're hearing this on Catalyst, you know me as the voice that is sometimes confused with Shayle. And I've got some news, so don't fast forward. Postscript Media, the company that I co-founded, that produces this podcast in collaboration with Canary Media, is soon going to be rebranding as Latitude Media. It will be a B2B news and analysis outfit covering the new frontiers of climate tech. We're going to still be partnering closely with Canary Media on the Carbon Copy and Catalyst podcasts, so rest assured these pods will continue, but we will be launching a new B2B news site covering business and tech trends across advanced grid tech, artificial intelligence, carbon removal, long-duration storage, and more. We've been hiring reporters and analysts, and you can go to latitudemedia.com to find out more when we launch in October. And that brings us quickly to two events coming up in October: Transition AI New York and Canary Live Bay Area. Transition AI is hosted by our team at Latitude Media. It's the premier event charting how artificial intelligence will shape utilities, renewables and storage developers, energy traders, and EV charging integrators. Transition AI New York is a one-day conference and workshop. It's in Manhattan. It'll be on October 19th, so mark your calendar. It'll feature top experts from Microsoft, GE Digital, AES, National Grid, Oracle, and a wide range of founders, executives, and academics who are building AI strategies right now. Plus, we're going to have a detailed market map of the industry that we've been working on, and our podcast listeners get 10% off if you go to transition-ai.com or follow the link in the show notes. You can get your ticket and use the code PSPODS10 on checkout. Transition AI New York. We'll see you October 19th. And for the folks in the Bay Area, our partners at Canary Media are putting together a live event on October 3rd. It's going to feature a roster of top journalists and experts that are handpicked by the Canary Media editorial team. It's at Freight and Salvage in Berkeley. And they're going to bring those experts together to talk about all things energy transition, Inflation Reduction Act implementation, and tech innovation. We recently played this popular conversation between futurist Ramez Nam and journalist David Roberts. That was recorded from Canary Live Seattle. So we got a great response from that episode. And if you liked it and you want to network and you're in the Bay Area, get your tickets for Canary Live Bay Area. Again, it's on October 3rd in Berkeley. We've got a link in the show notes. And now, on to the episode.
From the studios of Postscript Media and Canary Media.
I'm Shayle Kann, and this is Catalyst.
What ERCOT has accomplished here is truly remarkable. So Texas has around 40 gigawatts of installed wind. This is just under 30% of all U.S. wind power capacity. So the defining feature of ERCOT's interconnection process is that they don't rely on the interconnection process itself to identify and pay for grid upgrades.
So I'm off coffee at the moment. It's a long story, and I do not want to talk about it. But, hot tip, you know what's a great alternative? Talking about interconnection reform.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the public relations and strategic marketing agency of choice for energy transition and clean economy leaders. If you're a startup, investor, or enterprise that's creating positive change, Antenna Group's team of industry insiders and award-winning PR, marketing, and public affairs professionals are ready to help tell your story and drive business results. Learn more at antennagroup.com. Catalyst is brought to you by RE+. RE Plus Events is headed back to Las Vegas from September 11th through the 14th at the Venetian Convention Center and Expo. It's the biggest B2B clean energy event in North America, featuring solar, energy storage, hydrogen, fuel cells, and more. They're bringing the energy industry together to create a cleaner future for all, and you can learn from top business leaders across the industry. Catalyst listeners, here's a treat. Use promo code CATALYST20 to get 20% off an Expo Pass. Hurry and register at re-plus.com. That's re-plus.com.
I'm Shayle Kann. I invest in revolutionary climate technologies at Energy Impact Partners. Welcome. Okay, so I've said this before, and I will say it again. I think that interconnection, both of generation and of load, is rapidly becoming the single biggest barrier to the energy transition. Full stop. Hopefully, that'll explain to you why I wanted to do this episode, because I will freely admit it is wonky. But so is this issue. Basically, here's what we know. If you're a new electricity generator looking to connect to the grid, odds are high right now that you're either trying to connect solar or wind or batteries or a combination of those three. And it's taking you longer and longer and becoming more and more expensive for you to do so. Sure, that's a problem in and of itself in the context of fleet turnover, right? Like if we're going to be retiring tens of gigawatts of coal and replacing it in large part with clean power, we sure do need that clean power to be able to connect. But the reason that I'm so obsessed with the problem goes beyond that. Once electrification really starts to take hold, and we're adding millions of electric vehicles and heat pumps and battery manufacturing facilities and green hydrogen production facilities and direct air capture and, data centers to the grid, and we're trying to double or triple our total load on the grid, but we're already facing a bottleneck in interconnection before any of that happens at scale, you can imagine what might come next. But the interconnection issue is not a simple one, and the suite of solutions has to involve some regulatory reform. So that's the piece that we're going to talk about today. Tyler Norris has been thinking about this problem, previously as a solar developer trying to interconnect himself, but now as an academic thinking about it at the higher level. And he wrote a great paper about what sounds like a pretty simple idea, which is basically bring the process that has worked in ERCOT, the Texas electricity market, to the rest of the country. But of course, this is electricity, so nothing is simple. Let's hear it from Tyler. Tyler, welcome.
Great to be here, Shayle. Thanks so much for having me.
Let's get wonky about interconnection. Before we get super wonky about it, I'm interested in your high-level perspective on the state of interconnection in the U.S. today, particularly in light of the fact that until fairly recently, you were involved directly in interconnection by working at a renewable project developer. So you probably have seen it evolve to some degree over the past few years. So how would you characterize where we are at today and what the past few years have been like?
Yeah. Well, Shayle, I think it might actually help to start with an analogy here before we get too far into the weeds. So imagine with me that it's 1953, right? We've won the war, the economy's moving, automotive technology is advancing really quickly, and there's a demand for a lot more interstate commerce. The interstate highway system hasn't been built yet, right? There's a patchwork of smaller highways that connect each state. So President Eisenhower announces a new program, right, where trucking companies that want to transport goods across states can apply for the right to do so. Once they apply, they'll go through 1 or 2 years of study. These will be really intricate studies, right? We'll consider detailed forecasts of future traffic, weather patterns, wear and tear on roadways, and we'll consider a bunch of different extreme contingencies. And the output of these studies will identify where each trucking company's fleet is likely to contribute to traffic congestion. And when it does, they'll be assigned a portion of the costs required to expand those highways. And the idea is the trucking companies can't access the roadways until they've paid 100% up front for these future highway expansions. And so President Eisenhower goes out and he announces this and he says, this is expected to hopefully, maybe, if all goes well and all the stars align, lead to the development of an interstate highway system. And so it's an absurd analogy, of course, but I think it's not entirely dissimilar to how we've been approaching transmission interconnection in the United States. And so I think a lot of folks have seen the numbers on the queue backlog, but I think they're really instructive and worth just reviewing. So in 2022 alone, the backlog of projects in interconnection queues waiting to connect to the grid grew by 40%. It brought the total to just over 2,000 gigawatts. 80% of this growth was driven by solar and storage projects. And for comparison, we have around 1,200 gigawatts of generation capacity in the US that's operational. So of this 2,000 gigawatts, 1,350 around is generation capacity. Storage is about 700 gigawatts of that. And at the same time, we've seen, and this has been documented by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, the time required to interconnect has approximately doubled from around 15 years ago. So it used to be that the typical duration from interconnection request to commercial operation was around 2 years or just under, and now it's 4 years or more. And those timelines seem to be growing. And we've seen various pauses and entire interconnection queues. I think the most prominent example is in PJM. We've seen that elsewhere. But the queue backlog is a really good measure. But I think what we haven't seen until recently is a really clear comparative metric between markets that are using different interconnection rules to compare the outcomes. And we now sort of finally have those metrics, and I think they're really instructive.
Right. And I think that's what we want to spend a bunch of time on is talking about which markets, if any, are kind of doing it right or closer to right, and what we might learn about how to do it in the rest of the country. Before we get to that, so high level, I think folks at this point probably appreciate the dynamic you're describing, which is we're trying to connect. There are lots of developers trying to put lots more, mostly renewables, mostly solar and storage on the grid all over the country. That ballooned in the last year, probably in part because of the IRA, I suspect. Interconnection capacity to get through the queue, the pace of getting through the queue has not improved. And so you have way more trying to connect. You have the same capacity of throughput of studies, for example, and timelines have gotten longer. Everything has gotten more challenging. And now we're sitting on this gigantic queue backlog. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which regulates all the ISOs and RTOs, interconnection reform has been a thing people are talking about for a long time. So FERC did institute an order pretty recently, Order 2023, that I think has gotten sort of mixed reviews in terms of the impact that it might have on this challenge. Can you just briefly outline what that FERC order does and your thoughts on the degree to which it's going to solve this problem?
Yeah, so FERC Order 2023 is a meaningful step towards reform. It was a very comprehensive rulemaking process, incredible effort on the part of the FERC commissioners and their staff, and so many experts and stakeholders that contributed to that comment process. And the biggest thing that it does, right, it tries to speed up the interconnection process by moving from serial-based queue management to cluster study queue management. And what that basically means is traditionally the queues have been studied on a project-by-project basis, one project at a time. And what the idea is with clusters is that you'll do this in grouping studies, right? So every year you'll combine all the projects that have submitted during a certain window. You'll study them all at the same time. You'll look at the combined impact, and hopefully you'll be able to identify the necessary upgrades relatively quickly and then allow those projects to advance. And the hope is that you might be able to utilize this interconnection process to cover the cost of large upgrades by splitting those costs across a larger number of projects. And so that's kind of the working theory here. There are other important reforms that were included here. So reducing the number of speculative projects by imposing different requirements on interconnection customers to try to discourage what we might call speculative projects. There are other reforms trying to speed up. So, for example, limiting the reasonable effort standard that currently governs the completion of interconnection studies and imposing penalties on transmission providers for missing deadlines. There are other meaningful efforts here. There are reforms to the what's called the proportional impact method. So how do you allocate costs when they're identified in the form of network upgrades? There's an attempt to improve information access by requiring transmission providers to publish heat maps of their available transmission capacity. And then there's an effort to incorporate new technology into the interconnection study process. One of the most significant steps here was to evaluate the use of alternative transmission technologies. And so this is now required. So transmission providers will be required to look at the use of grid-enhancing technologies to attempt to mitigate network overloads. And then a few other pieces here and there. FERC has mandated that interconnection studies reflect the operating assumptions of electric storage and to make sure that they're not inappropriate assumptions being used there. And then a few other elements. But really, the main story here is around this hypothesis that transitioning from a serial-based queue to a cluster-based queue is going to speed up the interconnection process and do so at a lower cost.
And the principle there is if I'm on the other side of that and I'm getting request after request and I have to do a study each time, that's going to take me a lot more time with my fixed resources than it would to wait for 10 or 20 requests to come in and to do one bigger cluster study. That's basically the idea.
That's the hypothesis, Shayle. And there are some reasons to suspect that this can improve the interconnection rates in certain jurisdictions. What I think is fair to say is that we don't really have good empirical evidence to prove or disprove this hypothesis yet. There have been transmission providers that have shifted to cluster studies in recent years. I was very involved in one of those efforts for Duke Territory and some other utilities in the Southeast. And the truth is, I don't think we've seen conclusive evidence that it is, in fact, improving the pace of the interconnection process. And the reason for that, which I know we'll get into more detail, is that there are more fundamental issues with the interconnection process in most of the U.S., especially outside ERCOT, that unless they are resolved, are likely to contribute to ongoing delays.
Right. So if I can characterize your overall view here, it's that this FERC order is significant, it's impactful, but it's not enough. And in fact, the impacts may be more muted than you would hope. And so we should absolutely implement this order, but in addition, there's going to be more reform needed. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it was really well captured by Commissioner Clements in her concurrence to the order, which I encourage everyone to read if you're interested in digging deeper. But she said almost exactly what you said verbatim right there, Shayle, that this is a meaningful step, but there's a lot more to be done.
So let's talk about what else could be done. And in particular, we're going to talk about Texas. So as probably a lot of folks who listen here already know, Texas is the only state in the U.S. that has its own grid. And so things are different in Texas. And it sounds like you think that Texas is actually a model that we might think about replicating, or at least partially replicating in the rest of the country. Before we talk about what Texas actually does in terms of interconnection, let's talk about the impacts that it has had. So how has Texas performed in terms of interconnecting new generation relative to the rest of the country?
What ERCOT has accomplished here is truly remarkable. And I think maybe it's helpful to start by just capturing the total installed capacity, just to contextualize, right? So total installed capacity for wind to start, this story is better known, but so Texas has around 40 gigawatts of installed wind. It's 3 times more than any other state. So Iowa is the next at about 12.5 gigs. This is just under 30% of all U.S. wind power capacity. So that story is relatively well known. Solar is a newer phenomenon, and so ERCOT is now at about 17 gigawatts of utility-scale solar installed. The state at large at around 20 gigawatts of all solar. So it's now number 2 in the U.S., just behind California. And the utility scale side now appears effectively equivalent with California. Texas has just blown past every other state. You may recall at one point that North Carolina was number 2 in solar. Even as of 2018 or so, Texas was substantially behind. And just in a few years, they have interconnected a massive volume to surpass North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona. And so on an annual capacity additions basis, so in 2020, I think, is really where it starts to take off. So Texas interconnects 2.5 gigs of solar in that year. 2021, it explodes to 4 gigawatts. And then 2022, it's another 2.6 gigawatts, at least in ERCOT. And so over the course of 3 years, Texas added around 10 gigawatts of utility scale solar, which, that number alone is more than the installed solar capacity of every state except California.
And how much of that can be just attributed to the size of Texas? It's a big market, obviously, much bigger than Iowa, for example. So I know a part of it is going to be what we're going to talk about, which is how they manage interconnection. But is some of it just Texas is big?
There's no doubt that the size of Texas is part of the story here, but I think a comparison is instructive on this front too, right? So PJM is substantially larger, at least in terms of overall peak load, which, there are different ways we can measure this, but the overall peak load in PJM is approximately 2 times that in ERCOT, and yet PJM's interconnection rate overall for all resources over the past 2 years has been approximately 2.5 times less than ERCOT. So in that sense, this is not just about the overall size of Texas.
All right, so ERCOT's doing something right. So what is ERCOT doing? Walk us through ERCOT's interconnection process.
The defining feature of ERCOT's interconnection process is that they don't rely on the interconnection process itself to identify and pay for grid upgrades. And this enables them to interconnect projects much more quickly and at much lower cost. And what allows them to do this is that all generators in ERCOT are energy-only resources subject to economic and security curtailment, which means that ERCOT can turn them off for effectively any reason, according to market dispatch protocols. And so ERCOT manages its grid constraints by curtailing generators as necessary with that market dispatch. And so these generators can connect to the grid very quickly at relatively low cost, but with the understanding that they may be curtailed to mitigate any grid overloads. And this doesn't mean that ERCOT doesn't pursue grid upgrades. It's just that they do it via a separate transmission planning process. And their market structure enables them to really clearly measure these congestion costs that arise because of the system's inability to deliver lower cost available electricity to load. And so, a simplified example might be helpful here. So say you have a city, it's supplied by 2 large transmission lines. The first line connects to an aging coal plant, with a high cost of electricity that you don't want to run very much. The second line connects to several new large-scale wind and solar power plants that sell power much more cheaply. It's a hot summer day. The load ends up exceeding the capacity on the second line, and as a result, the city is forced to rely more on the coal plant, and the cheaper wind and solar generation gets curtailed because of the overload on that second transmission line. And so this is a simplified example, but this is occurring very often across ERCOT. These congestion costs, they're very meticulously documented and reported, and then ERCOT is able to use that market information to identify the most valuable set of incremental upgrades with the highest economic value. And it's worth noting that there are some really significant limitations to ERCOT's transmission planning process, and there are a lot of concerns that it doesn't incorporate the longer-term benefits of these upgrades, and the result is that they probably aren't pursuing as many proactive upgrades as they should. But I think the overall structure here is one that can be improved upon and provides potentially a model for other jurisdictions to think about.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the OGs of climatetech PR and marketing, representing a portfolio of over 75 category-leading companies in solar, storage, smart grid, EVs, electrification, carbon capture, sustainable materials, and decarbonization. Antenna is the trusted storyteller for companies disrupting the status quo, adopting sustainable practices, and creating innovative solutions for the world's most pressing issues. There's a reason why the Edison Awards named Antenna Group as the first innovation agency of the year. If you're a startup, investor, enterprise, or innovation ecosystem that's creating positive change, Antenna Group is ready to power your global impact. Visit antennagroup.com to learn more. Catalyst is brought to you by RE+. Mark your calendars for September 11th through the 14th and join your colleagues at the Venetian Convention Center and Expo. This isn't your average event. It's the largest B2B clean energy extravaganza in all of North America. Brace yourself for a mind-bogglingly large showcase of solar power, energy storage, hydrogen, fuel cells, grid edge technologies, EVs, and more. RE Plus Events is on a mission to unite the energy industry in a quest for a cleaner future. We're talking about a massive gathering of innovative minds and forward-thinking companies who are revolutionizing the way we power our world. And we've got an exclusive discount for all you Catalyst listeners. Use promo code CANARY20 and enjoy a 20% discount on an Expo Pass. Don't miss your chance to immerse yourself in the latest advancements and network with industry leaders. Hurry over to re-plus.com to learn more about this transformative event. Secure your spot. Again, re-plus.com.
If you're wondering what businesses are doing and what more they should do to confront climate change, then you should listen to Climate Rising. Produced by Harvard Business School and hosted by me, Professor Mike Toffel, Climate Rising gives you a behind-the-scenes view into how some of the world's best and brightest leaders are tackling climate change. From the boardroom and the C-suite all the way down the supply chain, wherever business meets climate, Climate Rising is there. Listen to Climate Rising from Harvard Business School, wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, so if I can try to repeat it back to you in layperson terms, basically the deal, so what ERCOT does is they say, okay, I'm going to, in one office over here, I'm going to, use all my market data and determine where I need to do transmission system upgrades. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it's an independent process from the interconnection queue. Meanwhile, on the interconnection side, I make a deal with any generator. And it's basically, come on in, go ahead and interconnect. I'm not going to, run a ton of studies and slow you down and take a long time. You're welcome to do it. You just have to wear the risk of me saying that I'm going to curtail you, which, of course, if I curtail you, then you're not getting paid for the generation. So you're going to bear more market risk on curtailment. But in exchange for that, I'll let you connect, and you're welcome to wear that risk. I'll give you all the data on the market to tell you, to be able to make that decision intelligently. And in some ways, that seems very much like it's a very Texas-like thing, right? It's kind of a very free market thing. Like, you want to wear the risk, generator? Go ahead. Maybe I'm going to curtail you, but go ahead and interconnect. Am I thinking about that right?
Yes, that's exactly right, Shayle. And it's worth noting too, though, that ERCOT does provide an assessment of the network upgrades that would be necessary if your project was required to alleviate them to comply with reliability standards. So they are still conducting interconnection studies that are, fully compliant with NERC reliability standards, and they do actually identify upgrades that would be necessary. But what they're saying is that, you're not required to address these upgrades as part of your interconnection process, but this is what you should be aware of so that you can incorporate this into your own assessment of the curtailment risk, and then ultimately incorporate that into the cost at which you can sell your power.
Right. Like, the results of that study is sort of for the generator, can be kind of a proxy for the likelihood of a certain magnitude of curtailment. Have we just empirically, given that Texas has been running it this way, are there generators that we can point to that have said, okay, I'm gonna take the risk, and that they've really made a mistake? Like, are there generators getting curtailed an inordinate amount of the time in some places?
I'm sure, Shayle, that is the case for certain generators that perhaps didn't fully incorporate the results of their studies into their curtailment risk analysis, or conditions change, right? Other generators show up. There are other aspects that the topology of the system can change. So I've no doubt, right, there are generators that are experiencing more curtailment than they estimated. On the flip side, there are very likely generators that are experiencing less than what they anticipated. And as you said, this is kind of the free market mindset, right? You are the master of your own destiny. We're going to empower you with as much data as we can to make an informed decision and to quantify the risk you're facing. But the proof is in the pudding, right? What we're seeing is that a very, very large number of generators believe that they are able to manage this risk, and that's contributing to this higher interconnection rate.
So it seems very logical to me on its face. Let's contrast it with what happens in the rest of the country. So I'm a prospective generator, and I submit an interconnection request outside of Texas. What happens in that case?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to understand here for your listeners is what's called the system impact study. And so what this does is it assesses the impact to the grid of the power flow from the proposed generator in interaction with the rest of the system. And so transmission providers use electricity simulation software to conduct this power flow analysis. One of the most common software packages is called Tara. And so what they do is they look out several years at a specific fixed point in time. It's called to get jargony, it's called a steady state circuit analysis. So it's a single snapshot of the balancing authority in time. They load your project in and all other generators that are committed to the system, all the existing operating generators, all those that have executed interconnection agreements, and then others that are ahead of you in queue. And then they run all these power balance equations for power flow simulation to capture the supply, the demand, the transfer of power throughout the system. And then what they do is they run all these contingency analyses where they look at these sort of extreme scenarios where different elements of the system go out, right? So a transmission line goes out, a transformer fails, and other scenarios. And so they test a bunch of these contingencies to see if your generator contributes to a network overload that then the question is then whether you have to resolve that overload. But that's that's what's going on with the power flow study in a nutshell. To be clear, the SIS it also looks at voltage and dynamic voltage and stability. So those are important elements. But really, I think the main story here about the system impact study is looking for these network upgrades as a result of power flow overloads.
I guess high level, when you hear this with fresh ears, I feel like the obvious thought process is, okay, the Texas mechanism, the ERCOT mechanism, seems much simpler from the generator's perspective. You can easily imagine how it's faster and you get more resources interconnected. On the other hand, this system impact study driven process in the rest of the country seems like it's kind of more bureaucratic and slower, but probably designed to ensure higher reliability. So you would imagine, if that's true and if it's successful at that the network in Texas would be less reliable, all else equal, than the network in the rest of the country. Do you have any evidence of whether that is or is not true?
What you say here is really important to acknowledge, right? So in every electricity market in the U.S. outside ERCOT, you do not have an energy-only market. So you also have capacity markets, and this is what's called the resource adequacy framework. And so when you study these projects under these sort of extreme contingencies, what you're doing is you're trying to assess them for what's called deliverability. And if they can pass all those contingencies and either don't trigger network upgrades or they do and then they resolve those upgrades, then they can qualify for capacity compensation and contribute to these resource adequacy requirements, right, which in aggregate take the form of these planning reserve margins that that indicate how much reserve margin every balancing authority has to have. And there's a whole process that goes into determining those reserve margins. But there's this resource adequacy market framework that governs essentially every electricity market in the U.S. outside of ERCOT. So we're unlikely to see other markets go in an energy-only direction. And the question is whether we can incorporate some of the learnings and the process improvements that ERCOT has achieved into this alternative framework where you have both energy and capacity markets. And it's not a simple task. It looks like there are meaningful improvements that can be made, but that is kind of the challenge that's upon us right now, is to figure out what can be adapted into the framework that exists outside ERCOT.
It's not intuitive to me. Maybe you can explain a little bit more why the fact that there are capacity markets outside of ERCOT makes it more difficult for them to implement Texas's interconnection process. Like, yes, there is I guess the measurement of the capacity value is driven by these system impact studies. So you need to do them in order to determine capacity values. It's something like that. Otherwise, like, why not just keep your energy plus capacity market, but implement a version of Texas's, go ahead and interconnect and wear the curtailment risk thing?
I think you're right that it is possible for transmission providers outside ERCOT, even with capacity markets, to implement an approach that would be energy only to allow for much faster, cheaper interconnection while pursuing proactive grid upgrades necessary to relieve congestion and ensure resource adequacy and reliability, and to do that via a separate transmission planning process. And so it's possible. It's going to require one or more transmission providers to get creative. And it's tricky, right? So there's a lot of kind of devil in the detail on how you structure this in the interconnection study process outside ERCOT, especially in the framework of these cluster studies. But this is the detail that we need to work through. But I agree with you. There should be no inherent reason why you couldn't adapt this even into markets with capacity markets.
So I think in some ways it is kind of intuitive given how you described the process, but maybe we can spend a minute more on exactly why the process, the interconnection process outside of Texas with the system impact studies and so on leads to such inefficiency and growing queues and long timelines.
So I think there are a lot of concerns with respect to the inefficiency of this existing approach outside ERCOT. And so, first, it appears to be temporally inefficient, right? So it takes a lot of time to work through these very detailed, intricate studies to identify these overloads and then allow for interconnection customers to decide whether or not they are going to relieve those upgrades. And it creates the possibility of a lot of cascading failure within those interconnection studies. So there's an aspect where it's temporally inefficient, it's bureaucratically inefficient, right? And just that it requires a lot of study resources. We are increasingly using the very limited number of transmission planners and engineers to conduct these massive interconnection studies because we're relying on the interconnection process itself to identify and fund network upgrades. And then it's economically inefficient. What we're seeing more and more is that it will save ratepayers money if we pursue these upgrades via a separate proactive process. And that's for a couple reasons. One is you don't have to go back incrementally and continue upgrading the system in response to interconnection customers. You can identify a set of low regrets or least regrets upgrades and do it all in one batch. So from an upgrade cost standpoint, it's inefficient. And then from the standpoint of accessing lower cost generation with lower production costs, it's also inefficient because it's creating an additional barrier to allowing, in many cases, lower cost resources to get online and supply the system. And then I think it's worth just mentioning one more. It's a little bit more debatable, but it's this concern about reliability risk that when we're retiring so many resources and we have now such substantial incoming load growth, we really need to get more capacity online onto the system more quickly. And if you're creating unnecessary barriers to entry, it could introduce a reliability risk.
Okay, so if you're in charge of PJM or MISO or CAISO or some market outside of Texas, and you could wave a somewhat realistic magic wand, in other words, you can reform the interconnection process, but you're not going to do the fundamental structural market reform. Like you can't turn, PJM into an energy-only market all of a sudden. How would you distill like what could be done within the bounds of reality?
Yeah. So assuming that you're still going to have generators pursuing the interconnection process to receive capacity rights, you have to figure out a way how to study both energy-only resources in these interconnection studies alongside these capacity resources. And this is tricky, but there should be a relatively simplified approach to this. And so there are a number of experts in FERC's rulemaking process that recommended that instead of one big combined, integrated cluster with both energy only and capacity resources, that you just do this in two steps, right? So you start off with a cluster that's energy only, and at the end of that process, the interconnection customers will make a go, no-go decision on whether they're going to proceed. And then you take all those and then you run the second stage, which includes all the capacity resources. In that study, you turn off the energy only resources because again they're not receiving capacity and they're not contributing to overloads because they'll be curtailed in real time. So pursuing a two-step study process with energy only first, followed by capacity resources, I think is a relatively simple one that can be adopted quickly. There's also reforms that can be made to what's called the impact threshold. So this is the question of when do you actually assign upgrades even to energy only resources? And there was a lot of debate in the FERC rulemaking around what is the proper impact threshold. And we've seen reasonable thresholds work in various markets around 20%. So I think there's a case to be made that if you're taking this approach, you can relax that impact threshold. That's something that transmission providers can do on their own. And then there are a few other details here that we could go through, but the biggest additional piece is improving the proactive transmission planning process and not relying as much on the interconnection process. And there, we could have a whole podcast, of course, dedicated to proactive transmission planning. There's a separate FERC rulemaking going on, considering various options to improve it. But one of the simplest things is just looking out over a longer period of time to estimate the cost savings that occur from different transmission upgrades, so that you capture that in the cost-benefit analysis in order to identify the least regrets set of proactive upgrades.
Yeah, in other words, it should be a cost-benefit analysis, not just a cost analysis.
Exactly.
All right. Well, sounds like we should have a future conversation on proactive transmission planning. But in the meantime, Tyler, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks so much, Shayle. Really great to be here.
Tyler Norris is a PhD candidate at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. He's also a former VP of Development at Cypress Creek Renewables. This show is a co-production of Postscript Media and Canary Media. You can head over to canarymedia.com for links to today's topics. Postscript is supported by Prelude Ventures, a venture capital firm that partners with entrepreneurs to address climate change across a range of sectors, including advanced energy, food and ag, transportation and logistics, advanced materials and manufacturing, and advanced computing. This episode was produced by Daniel Waldorf. Mixing by Roy Campanella and Sean Marquand. Theme song by Sean Marquand. I'm Shayle Kann, and this is Catalyst.